Hi everyone. I'm very happy to be opening this conference today. This is the second of two undergraduate musicology conferences that have been held here this year. And I'd like to say a very big thank you to our musicology teaching staff, Michelle, Jake and Joe. They came up with this idea in the first place. They applied for funds. They have creatively worked with students, all of you, to organise all the many details that are involved in a conference like this, and you probably have a lot more idea of how many details are involved now. And I'm wondering if this conference perhaps indirectly flows out of the reading and discussion groups, I haven't asked you this, that these three have taken over many years, all in their own time, and it's really great to see students now presenting their work to an audience rather than just an in-house discussion group. The first musicology conference that was held here in June was very successful, and as this one will, it provided an opportunity for students to show their high quality work as thinkers and researchers. This is just the beginning of a journey. And this is something that students can do regularly as performers, for example, but there's not usually an audience for presenting work as musicologists. So thank you again for making this happen. So a very warm welcome to you all, and especially to Dr. Michelle Locke, who is going to welcome us to country. Thanks, Michelle.
Before I start the welcome, I just want to apologise on behalf of my son. So in your program it says that Nicholas Howie is doing the welcome, and he is quite devastated and upset this morning that he's not able to be here. So although you don't get the original article, you get the woman who brought that article into the world. And I'm sure it won't be as flash or as entertaining as Nicholas, but I am here to offer you the welcome today. So, Bujuri Malinwo, Dia Giora, Michelle Locke, Ingain Gora Darupudien. Good morning, my name is Michelle Locke, I'm a Daruk woman. My connection to this country is through my maternal grandmother, and it goes all the way back to Maria Locke, her father Yaramandi, his father Gumbori, who was the Karaji, or the chief of the Buruburungu nation of the Daruk clan. It is my honour to offer you on behalf of my ancestors and elders this welcome to country. I offer my respect to all of you here today, to Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and First Nations people, but my respect to all of your ancestors and elders that have paved the way for us to walk, that have passed down their songs and messages for us to share and to continue on. When I looked at the title on your program that says Music Talks, it made me straight away think about how music is used for Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people in our communities. Our song lines, which you may have heard that expression before, our song lines tell our stories of our networks and kinships and moieties across country. We are sung to learn language. We are sung to learn our laws and culture. We are sung to celebrate, to welcome new babies, to grieve and farewell people when they pass. To me, music is, I was going to say an international language, but it's more than that. It's when you hear a song, even if you hear a song in a different language and you don't know that language, you can tell if that song is celebrating, if it's sad, if it's joyous. There is something so powerful about music and song. And I think what you are doing is so valuable and so priceless to all of us. So I would like to congratulate all the students here today. Yes, you're on a learning journey. Don't expect to be perfect, all right? This is part of your journey. But what you're doing is sharing the knowledge that you have gained so far, and you're sharing it from your spirit and your heart. So be proud of yourself, and give yourself a pat on the back and say, yes, I'm here and I'm doing this. Lastly, at your last conference, I know that Aunty Jacinta Tobin was here, and she sang music for you. So I'm going to use a little bit of language that I learned from her from a song that she wrote. Because I'm trying to tie this welcome very much into your theme today. So, the words go like this. Nalawa midaga garamburo, dijirigo yanajanawi, bubuwu ingami. Come in, sit down. A good friend is happy to see you. Thank you for walking with me and strengthening my spirit. I hope you have an excellent conference. Be proud of yourselves. You are changing the world.
I'd like to thank Michelle for that very warm welcome to country, and I'd like to also pay my respects to the Darug Nation elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to welcome any Indigenous people who are present, and also like to join Nicholas in his statement in the program of the concept of sharing knowledge and being on a shared journey, because that's the essence of what we're doing today. But I'm here delighted to welcome Dr. Sarah Kirby to our gathering. Dr. Kirby is the Granger Fellow at Melbourne University, which I understand means that she is fundamentally engaged with research in and around the Granger Museum. The Granger Museum was established by Australian composer Percy Granger in 1938 with the aim, to paraphrase his statement of intent from 1955, of documenting what he described as progressive music from English-speaking and Scandinavian composers. The museum was founded on Granger's personal collection of a variety of artefacts, manuscripts, musical sketches, letters, portraits and mementos. So this seems an association that couldn't be more appropriate, as Dr. Kirby's research concentrates on the reception of music in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with particular attention given to the display and dissemination of and discourses surrounding music and music performance through museums and exhibitions. These interests are manifested in Kirby's 2022 monograph, Exhibitions, Music and the British Empire, an intersection of reception studies and historical musicology. I take it the word exhibition here is used in the broad sense of grand world fairs, where the supposedly latest and greatest contribution to the arts, culture, technology and research are on display for the wonderment and education of the masses. Sarah's presentation today will demonstrate, I think, the resonance of her approach to many questions that we as scholars pose to contemporary music, and which we continue to grapple with. That is, the impact of nationalism on music and culture more broadly, the critical reception of popular music and its relation to the status of classical or art music, the notion of curation and the ways in which choices of what musics are presented or highlighted betrays the agenda of the curator or institution, and this is something that my popular music histories students present here will know that I've talked often about in the subject, the matter of who gets to tell the story and what we can learn by studying who gets to tell the story and what they choose. And of course also the ways in which gender can play out in all of these things. As well as her fellowship with the Granger Museum, Sarah is the Associate Editor of the journal Musicology Australia and 2022 Nancy Keesing Fellow at the State Library of New South Wales. We're very fortunate to have her here to share her perspectives with us, not only in this keynote, but as chair of a panel of papers tomorrow. To present her paper, Allowing the Enemy to March into the Citadel Unopposed, Nationalism and Music at 19th Century International Exhibitions in the British Empire, Please make welcome Dr. Sarah Kirby.
Thank you for having me. I'll just get my PowerPoint up. When I was doing my PhD, my supervisor always said you should never have a title longer than 10 words because it confuses people, and I absolutely did not take that on board. So here we go. All right, so the State Library of Victoria holds this ridiculously large source in its collections. It's called the Visitors Register of the 1880 Melbourne International Exhibition. It's a guest book, basically, which is more than half a metre long. It's about 20 centimetres thick. It's very large, is the point I'm making here. It contains over 15,000 signatures and comments of people who attended the first ever international exhibition held in the colony of Victoria. I think basically it just provides a really remarkable insight to the experience of this event. The register records how, as the stifling Melbourne summer started, there was apparently not enough fresh air about the place, according to one commenter, though another person noted that the cellars are delightful on a warm day. The food and drink apparently left much to be desired. One visitor from New Zealand thought the pie's bad, coffee worse, exhibition good. While another described the catering as execrable. That's nice. They always say, don't read the comments, but this is essentially like your 19th century comment section from the inexplicable anti-Semitism to predatory men leering at the foreign ladies or complaining about a lack of good-looking girls at the exhibition, to attacks by free trade advocates opposed to Graham Berry's protectionist government's championing of this event, describing it as his white elephant, as an embarrassment, and one even suggested that Mr. Berry ought to be buried in it. So clever. On the whole, most of the comments are pretty positive. The exhibition was glorious, it was splendid, magnificent, spifflicating, I'm not sure if that's a good word or not. There are the occasional humbugs or complaints, such as this person here who thought there was too much marmalade on display. You can't please everybody, I suppose, but most interesting, I think, are the constant references through this book to music. These comments illuminate a common set of expectations around what kind of music should be heard in these spaces and what its function should really be. So there wasn't much music in the early months of this exhibition, and visitors consistently mention this in the first pages of this book with frustration. As William Dwyer of Hotham described it, it was rather monotonous for want of music. As the months went on, musical activity increased, and they finished finally building the big organ at one end of the building, and once that was done, it started to draw particular attention. Someone called Henry J. Francis of Sydney said he would like to see the organ performed on every afternoon, although an R. Ogden of Sandridge proclaimed the organ a great failure. Someone called Thomas Tregear of Longully and Sandhurst thought the organ was splendid, while a G.E. Madison of Wandillagong suggested that the organist ought to have his head knocked off. Many of these comments, interestingly, also draw comparisons with other exhibitions. A number reference the Sydney International Exhibition that had been held the previous year, with John Tilburn, all the way from Carlton. If you don't know Melbourne geography, that's like across the road from the building. He asked why we couldn't be provided with some decent music daily as they had been in Sydney. Melbourne was also frequently compared to the London Great Exhibition of 1851, pictured here. And all of this suggests, I think, that across the empire there were these sort of networks of ideas transmitted and shaping expectations around how exhibitions should function and what they should involve, including conveying ideas about music. From the Great Exhibition, which was held in the enormous Crystal Palace, international exhibitions were some of the most significant cultural phenomena of the 19th century. These were 6-month-long events. They basically invited different countries to send in objects, their artistic, scientific, industrial and cultural products in a kind of competitive display environment, in a manner supposedly demonstrating overall the breadth of human endeavour. There were displays of almost anything you could imagine in these spaces, from fine arts and design and decorative objects to just functional objects. These are some fireplaces from Sheffield, just everyday things for the home. Or there were vast halls of machinery, often in motion to demonstrate the newest technologies. Many exhibitions also had electricity halls where visitors could see the massive generators that were sort of powering the event itself. Exhibitions were held all over the world through the 19th century, not just in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe, in Scandinavia, in a number of North and South American countries, and indeed across the British Empire, including in Canada, in South Africa, in India, in New Zealand, and in Australia, the Australian colonies. These vast events used an organisational rhetoric that grandly reinforced themes of universalism, of cosmopolitanism, and monogenism. But paradoxically, they were also inherently nationalistic, that the hosts unfailingly curated the exhibits in a kind of carefully articulated cultural hierarchy with themselves at the top, obviously. Now, this age of exhibitions coincided as well with the peak of European musical nationalism. And you certainly see this play out in the offerings of music at many exhibitions. Yet, at those held in the British Empire, the question of national musical supremacy was a bit of a fraught one, tied to a kind of long-standing inferiority complex regarding colonial cultural insecurity, and that hackneyed assertion that Britain was das Land ohne Musik. So at British and Australian exhibitions, particularly, discussion of nation was actually generally avoided in discussion of music, with one exception, and that was popular music. In these spaces, the combination of foreign musicians, often commanding large salaries, as well as the kind of low status of the music, brought out actually a really virulent strain of nationalism, particularly in the local musical press. So in this paper, I'm going to present 3 different case studies, exploring the ways that nationalism entered into the critical reception of popular musics at these exhibitions. After discussing the ideas of nationalism and internationalism as they relate to both exhibitions and music of this time, I'll first look at the response to Edward Strauss's orchestra at an exhibition in London in 1885. Then I'll talk about the reception of the Austrian Strauss band at an exhibition in Melbourne in 1880. And then finally, I'll consider the reception of the Viennese Ladies Orchestra at the 1886 exhibition in Liverpool, where the tensions that came from the employment of a non-British orchestra were further complicated by issues of gender. The narrative of universalism that really cloaked these events, and much of the official rhetoric surrounding them, was first set out by Prince Albert at his first speech promoting the Great Exhibition at the Mansion House in 1850. Albert espoused a confident brand of internationalism that saw the distances that separated different nations gradually vanishing before the achievements of modern invention, to quote David Raisman and Ethan Roby. According to Albert, the Great Exhibition would be a living picture of the point of development at which the whole of mankind has arrived. Yet, within the structures of this, as well as later exhibitions as well, there was an inherent paradox. So, universalism might have been the aim, but the objects were displayed in explicitly national terms. The host nation basically had total control over the way the exhibits were arranged, and they pretty much unfailingly curated these to present different cultures in a hierarchy with itself at the top. They might do this by giving more floor space or more prominence to certain exhibits, or by emphasising aspects of manufacturing that their home nation really excelled at, such as the enormous amount of space dedicated to mining at Australian exhibitions. We do that apparently. This court representing the mining town of Bendigo is bigger than some of the other entire country's spaces at the Melbourne exhibition. So while exhibitions were presented as microcosms that would summarise the entire human existence, their hierarchies of display were articulated to portray different nations as occupying fixed places in a kind of global order. These nationalistic tendencies in representation are equally present in Australian and British exhibitions that I'm talking about here. So you find in Britain these kind of avowals of peace and progress and universalism only really came alongside the assertion of Britain's position as the first industrialised nation and the most powerful and advanced state. In Australia, commissioners consciously constructed self-promotional kind of narratives about, to quote Darian Smith, striding forward on the world stage, presenting an Australian national identity that conjured images of a wealth of resources and progressive ideals. Now, all of this was happening against a background of European musical nationalism, which also reached its peak in the second half of the 19th century. Musical nationalism is often described as an attempt at an emancipation from the cultural hegemony of Teutonicism, culminating in efforts to create a kind of locally idiomatic music. This might be done in lots of different ways. So you could have elevating folk music, asserting that certain composers' works are imbued with a national spirit based on aspects of their biography, lots of different ways this can manifest. But many argue that there's actually rarely anything inherently national in the music itself. The idea of nation within a musical work is really the product of extrinsic markers. This means that national musics are largely defined by how they're used rather than what they contain. In the musical departments of many exhibitions around the world, music was presented within this kind of explicitly national framework, so you couldn't help but read it as national. A good example of this is the French Exposition Universelle, held in Paris in 1889, which is well known both as the event that the Eiffel Tower was built for, and also the first time that Claude Debussy first experienced the Indonesian gamelan and the kind of influence that had on his composition. This was an event steeped in Republican rhetoric, commemorating the centenary of the 1789 revolution. The musical program here was designed specifically to showcase French national musics and achievements, with 5 orchestral concerts given in the Trocadero in the background here, since demolished. These concerts aim to display the immense superiority of French music, as contemporary critic Alfred Bruneau put it. Annegret Fauser, in her amazing book about this exhibition, describes how these performances were heard alongside other concerts of different national musics. So, they'd have like a Russian night, and then they'd have a German night, and then, whatever, that sort of thing, which created a context where critics could both draw direct comparisons between different national musics and also engage in essentialist stereotyping. To quote Fauser, music from abroad was received first and foremost as picturesque and always lacking in substance when compared to that of France. Yet, at the exhibitions held at the same time, even almost the same year in the British Empire, this was just rarely the case. At British and Australian exhibitions, they generally avoided discussion of nation in the musical department. Although nationalist rivalries did emerge in the display of instruments manufactured in different countries, in performed music, musicians from across Europe generally played a diverse repertoire, and the press rarely made any judgment based specifically on where it had come from. At an organisational level, there was a fairly deliberate avoidance of making art music a nationalist matter. So for the most part, British exhibitions described their musical offerings as didactic, not a forum to show off British music, but an opportunity to kind of educate the public on music overall. It took Australia a little bit longer to work out that this might be a good approach. Though at the Sydney 1879 exhibition, the organisers considered a proposal that only works by Australian composers should be heard, based on the suspicion that as Australians have asserted a preeminence over their British brethren in the physical pastimes of cricket and rowing, they might also succeed in music, to quote the official record. This proposal, however, was rejected because they decided that music was not alone a universal language, making it unwise to restrict the musical performances to any local idiom. But the organisers also noted that the Australian School of Composition in 1879 was slightly limited, which might suggest the real reason for dismissing the proposal. The only critical response to music in these British and Australian exhibitions that might be described as nationalistic is found almost exclusively in the reception of popular music. And that's, in these cases, brass bands and light orchestras that provided entertainment kind of music rather than anything else. This was especially the case when lots of money was spent on bringing these musicians out. So, what do I actually mean by popular, scare quotes, music here? This is obviously a bit of a slippery term, particularly in kind of binary distinction from a high art music or something like that. But really what I mean here is just popular. It was stuff that people liked, people wanted to come and listen to. Music that would draw and please a large crowd. This kind of music was important for exhibitions because they were enormous, expensive events to run. They had to make sure they got as many people to buy tickets as possible, so it was definitely a commercial endeavour as well. So the music used for this purpose across most of the late 19th century exhibitions was either brass or military bands or light orchestras who performed mostly in bandstands in the very highly landscaped gardens that surrounded the exhibition buildings. A carnival atmosphere in these spaces was created by promenades, refreshment rooms, and large, often illuminated fountains, which probably doesn't sound that exciting now, but that was very new technology at the time. The Melbourne 1888 exhibition's pleasure gardens included an aquarium with daily fish, seal, and sea lion feedings. They had stalactite caves and grottos, a fernery, a hydraulic lift to the building's dome, which this week has started working again, which is very exciting after 100 years. There was a switchback railway, which is kind of like a proto-roller coaster. You can see one from Glasgow here. While other exhibitions featured things like archery fields and swimming pools and bowling greens and mazes and panoramas and other rides. So it was a very carnival atmosphere. Surrounded by so many amusements, what we might more accurately describe the music these bands provided is what Derek Scott calls non-serious music. So that's music perceived not as taxing the mind, being consumed merely as amusement, usually alongside the distractions of talking, laughing and dancing. A music defined by its supposed complicity with acts of effortless consumption. There were lots of complaints made about this whole space, that the garden entertainment was somehow interfering or distracting people from the exhibition's more educative potential. So already any music heard in these spaces, whether it was performed by locals or not, was already seen as being of pretty low status and clearly tainted as commercial and utilitarian rather than artistic and enlightening and all of that good stuff. In general, the bands that played were both military and civilian, so groups like the Grenadier Guards and the Coldstream Guards, and in Australia, military groups from places like Sandhurst and Horsham and Kyneton. And they played a pretty codified set of music of operatic overtures, waltzes, selections, fantasias, potpourris, that kind of stuff. It seems that these bands, wherever they were from, really did draw a crowd. People loved this stuff. And actually the public responded really, really positively, even to visiting bands. At an exhibition in Edinburgh, for example, Axel Svensson, the conductor of the Royal Swedish Värmland Grenadiers, was mobbed by admirers following his band's final performance and needed a police guard to get through this adoring crowd, apparently. Similarly, at the Glasgow exhibition, apparently lots of women embarrassed the conductor of the visiting Blue Hungarian band by showering him with numerous floral offerings at every performance. Yet, throughout all of these bands' tenure, the musical press is filled with critics and letter writers and angry people describing their presence as an offensive lack of investment in local music. The nationalism that arises in their reception was of the kind that Karl Dahlhaus describes as emerging as an expression of a politically motivated need, appearing when national independence is being sought, denied, or jeopardised rather than attained or consolidated. Now, this obviously sounds a little bit melodramatic, but for many critics, the employment of foreign bands in the context of an exhibition, which was, for all its universalist rhetoric, a showcase of national achievements, this was considered an attack on their own local musicians, denying their nation's musical independence or something like that. Now this is clearly to do with those extrinsic markers of nation as the works played by the bands and light orchestras overall were pretty much the same no matter where the band was from. There was nothing inherently British or Australian in the works that were being played. Wagner, Meyerbeer, Rossini were all as popular as Sullivan or anyone else like that. Some of the most spectacular criticism in this vein appeared in response to the London 1885 exhibition, at which the Strauss Orchestra played. Now, a man called Thomas Reynolds, who was a viola player in the Halle Orchestra, protested the engagement of foreign bands in a series of letters to the musical world. Actually, only 2 groups out of the 13 bands that were employed at this exhibition weren't British. They were the 5th Pomeranian Blucher Hussars and the Strauss Orchestra. But totally discounting the other 11, Reynolds expressed his astonishment and disgust that German and Austrian bands were to be employed, given an apparent lack of available work in London for English performers. He then turned to argue that the visiting musicians might then choose to stay in England after the exhibition, taking up their residence permanently in this country, as invariably happens on such occasions, thereby still further reducing the daily diminishing incomes of English musicians. I must say, I did part of my PhD in the UK in 2016 when the Brexit vote happened, and this rhetoric, it was sometimes hard to tell whether I was reading like 2016 papers or 1885 papers. Just, yeah. Concluding with a call to arms for British musicians, Reynolds eventually suggests that supporting the employment of a German band or an Austrian band was treasonous. His letter is basically every sensationalist nationalist trope you could think of that are still being employed today. He says, "I have heard a great outcry about the want of patriotism of those few individuals who dare to rejoice at the successes gained by the brave and patriotic Arabs of the Sudan, yet surely even such conduct cannot be compared with those high-born and intellectual Englishmen, most of whom are supported by contributions of the English taxpayers," always got to mention the taxpayers, "to whom have been confided the arrangements for an English national exhibition, but who not merely neglect the fine opportunity thus afforded them by providing a little extra employment for their not overly wealthy fellow countrymen, but put themselves to a deal of trouble and probably extra expense to bring over a body of foreigners to compete with English musicians." So that wasn't the end of it. In his next letter, Reynolds continued his diatribe using intensely militaristic language about the painful results that were due to the apathy and dilatoriness of British musicians who had left the press to fight their battles for them, having first allowed the enemy to march into the citadel unopposed. Now, obviously Reynolds was just one guy, though he styled himself as speaking on behalf of the whole British musical industry. The World provided, though, a platform for his ideas in one of the most prominent and widely read musical newspapers of the period. He was certainly not the only writer, though, to criticise the employment of Strauss. So if we turn specifically to look at this Strauss example, the Strauss Orchestra, conducted by Edward Strauss, pictured here in the centre, who was the brother of Johann II, the waltz guy, and the son of Johann Senior. And he was employed to perform twice a day for 2 months at the London 1885 exhibition. This orchestra occupied a kind of interesting midpoint on the continuum between high art offered in other parts of the exhibition, such as early music ensembles from Belgium or the Netherlands who performed in the Albert Hall, as well as more popular military and brass bands in the grounds, so they're kind of in between those two extremes. Using both string and wind instruments, the orchestra performed a mixture of waltzes and quadrilles, the kind of stuff that you associate with the Strauss name, as well as less typical orchestral versions of high art works, including, in one instance, an arrangement by Joseph Strauss of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata for band. You can see this in one of the programs that I got here. As George Bernard Shaw described him, a musically endowed man may be either a Richter or a Christy minstrel. Strauss holds an intermediate position between the two extremes. One of the main things that really enraged critics and musicians was the salary of £6,000 that Strauss was awarded, which is roughly sort of £800,000 today, so quite a lot of money. It sounds like a lot though, but as very few in the press acknowledged, this was to cover all of the performers' travel and their expenses and their salaries too. It wasn't just a single payment to Strauss himself. A writer in the Musical Opinion was particularly indignant, questioning the importation of instrumentalists who are admitted, even when their speciality of dance music is concerned, to be no better than, if so good as, our home musicians. And so this generalised kind of outrage about the amount of money being spent on foreign music really set the tone for the orchestra's overall critical reception when they finally played. So their initial concert in a bandstand in the gardens, you can see an illustration of Strauss here, along with Strauss depicted as this energetic conductor. This was very, very poorly received in the Musical Times. They wrote, "They came, they saw, but it can be scarcely said that they conquered." There was so much criticism that in the first couple of weeks of their performances that the organisers decided to move them from the gardens into the Albert Hall, thinking that maybe it was like the outdoor venue that was to blame. The Musical World, though, reported that the real reason for the venue change was the adverse opinions passed, so the press was feeling very powerful here. The move indoors only encouraged even more critical scrutiny, with the Musical Times reporting that never before had critics been called together to pronounce a serious verdict in such a way. Strauss's first indoor program contained many of his signature waltzes, but also transcriptions of Wagner, Schubert, and English songs, and to quote the Musical World's critic, a most cruel distortion of Chopin's Funeral March. The performance was considered a direct challenge to earlier criticism, but was also a vindication as the critical assessments just didn't change. Despite apparently all of these educated music critics hating it, I thought I would play you a little bit of Strauss, mainly because I've already been talking for ages, but also because I kind of like it. Are you allowed to say you like Strauss now? It's very trashy. I've tried so hard to find a recording of either the Beethoven Moonlight Sonata for Band or the Funeral March, but I doubt they were ever published or written down, let alone recorded. So we'll make do with Strauss's finale here, the Jugendfeuer, from a program in June. Whoop, too far. Yeah. If I can get it to play. Oh, it's doing it again. Okay. Of much of the press's attacks on Strauss, even by their own reports, audiences really enjoyed this orchestra. And even the Musical Times admitted that Strauss gave pleasure to an enormous number of people. In light of this, class started to pervade the critical response. Bernard Shaw noted that a large crowd was not an achievement in itself, as the same number of heads he said, could be attracted by a Christie minstrel show, a variety entertainment, or a prize fight, the only difference being their character and class. The fervent public reception was particularly lamented in the musical press in comparison to the very small audiences who were showing up to what they saw as more kind of edifying or educational things like early music performances. Shaw also mocked a substantial British matron who, during a performance by the Bristol Madrigal Society, walked proudly into the amphitheatre with her daughter, hesitated and said in a distinct and audible voice, "This isn't Strauss, is it?" Her daughter looked suspiciously at melodious Bristol and replied doubtfully, "I don't think it can be." "Then come out of this," said the matron, and retired somewhat indignantly. One of the biggest criticisms of the Strauss Orchestra was that they were just purely entertainment, intended to draw a crowd to the exhibition and therefore commercially utilitarian. The Times described the engagement as agreeable to the public and useful to the entrepreneur, but hoped that the educational purpose of the exhibition would not be thrown into shade by them. The Musical Times editor Henry Lunn also suggested that though music was made a prominent feature of the prospectus, no important results for the art was to be had. While Strauss may have greatly added to the profits of the exhibition, he wrote, "The art of music itself cannot have in the slightest degree benefited from this excessive outlay." So if I turn now to an Australian example, in 1880, the first Melbourne International Exhibition engaged the Austrian Strauss Band, military and orchestral, in brackets, conducted by Alois Wildner, and as far as I can see, there's no connection between these two bands. There are no Strausses involved here. I think they were just using the name Strauss because it was Austrian and wanting to promote themselves with that marketing. Anyway, their engagement began pretty inauspiciously when the ship they were travelling on was seriously delayed and all of their concerts had to be postponed. The celebrated band of 55 players who laid claim to a repertoire even more extensive than the famous Coldstream Guards, to quote the exhibition's daily programme, were considered to give the most brilliant examples of military music in the world. On arrival, they played first at the Flemington Racecourse, as they're featured here, and at the Melbourne Town Hall in performances of unqualified success. And their first concert at the exhibition drew the biggest audience that it had seen since its opening day. In this example, criticism of the band actually didn't come from the press. By all accounts, both press and public were just thrilled that the Austrians were there. It was overwhelmingly positive to their very choice selection of works that promoted no feeling but that of the highest admiration, to quote The Age. Performing crowd favourites such as the Grand March from Meyerbeer's Le Prophète, Rossini's William Tell Overture, Strauss waltzes and selections from Donizetti operas, the band performed some of their programme in a military band formation and some of it in an orchestra, though I couldn't tell you which works they did in what formation, but apparently it worked very well. The Argus newspaper reported how finely their repertoire choices brought out that dual character, and the band drew so much public attention that huge sections of the building were apparently left totally empty anytime they were playing, because all the visitors just crowded to hear the music. Despite this favourable public reception, the response among local musicians was one of outrage, and the musical community acted very swiftly, giving into a strong sense of rivalry based not even on the performances, like before they'd even got there, just based simply on the hype that was being created in the press. A number of Melbourne musicians formed a competing Australian band, conducted by Léon Caron, the French migrant and composer who was already really prominent in the exhibition, having composed the opening cantata. The Sydney Morning Herald gleefully described the formation of this competing Australian band as entirely related to the proverbial susceptibilities and jealousies of musicians. The arrival of the Austrian Strauss band and the enthusiasm with which the performances have been received seem to have disturbed and aroused every morsel of envy and jealousy which exists in the breasts of the musicians of Victoria, and all petty rivalry sank into insignificance in the resolve to avenge the supposed indignity put upon them by the importation of a foreign band. The 90 people members of the Australian band, the Sydney Morning Herald was quick to point out, were actually mostly migrants and therefore Australian in name only, and they included every single local player of repute. They also attempted to match the Austrians by setting up both a military and an orchestral formation. And the sense of rivalry was so strong that all the players also performed throughout the whole exhibition for free. Now, you might be able to argue that this was all set up in good faith and it was just a bunch of local musicians wanting to demonstrate their own music making at the international exhibition, regardless of what the Austrian band was doing. But that all starts to fall apart when you realise that they decided to mimic the Austrians' programs too, with the Australians' first program including many of the same works, such as the Rossini-William Tell Overture, the Grand March from Meyerbeer's Les Prophètes, selections from operas by Donizetti, in an act that the Sydney Morning Herald described as being in bad taste and worse discretion. Their reception was pretty mixed. The Sydney Morning Herald noted how humiliating it was to hear well-respected local musicians engaging in such parochialism and making remarks against the invasion of strangers, particularly in Australia where such a large part of the population, particularly of musicians, were migrants already. Audiences do seem to have enjoyed the performances, so people liked hearing music anyway, but the Argus noted that the band demonstrated a want of practicing together that barred the way to an artistic finish, probably because they'd been formed so quickly. And this was particularly noticeable in comparison to the Austrians, amongst whose members, to quote the Argus, perfect drill has produced complete subjection of the individual members to the will of the conductor. So my final example takes place in Liverpool in 1886, where once again the press was filled with angry reviews and letters decrying the employment of a foreign band, and this time further compounded by contemporary arguments about gender and music, and women's capacity to perform to the same standard as men. So the Viennese Ladies Orchestra, conducted by Marie Schepek, played regularly at the Liverpool exhibition throughout the season. They were originally scheduled to play in the building's concert hall, but the building wasn't actually finished when the exhibition opened, so they got moved out into a bandstand in the gardens with all of the other men's bands. The orchestra's programs appear to be similar to those of the other military bands that were at the exhibition, made up of potpourris, selections, overtures, waltzes, and quadrilles, all the usual stuff. But I say appears because it's actually quite difficult to discuss their musical choices in detail because no printed programs have survived. And while the press usually would give a full list of the program of all of these bands and what they played each day, they don't do this for the Ladies Orchestra. Instead, when critics are not describing the women's appearances, reviews are largely filled with outrage at the band's employment and £2,000 payment, which is about £280,000 today. As the Liverpool Review commented, at the end of their sojourn here, they will return well satisfied to their native haunts, having lined their pockets pretty thickly with British gold. The Liverpool Mercury was indignant that an orchestra whose members are permanently resident in England had not been employed, given, as their critic believed, there were better qualified performers in our own country, in our own city, capable of more than an occasional operatic selection and a string of polkas, waltzes and quadrilles. So in their criticism of Strauss at London the previous year, critics had kind of legitimised their anger by undermining the performer's abilities and harshly criticising the performance elements and repertoire choices. In the case of a women's orchestra, discussion over the music was kind of almost unnecessary because these critics could use the performer's gender to undermine their employment, as well as their professional status. So during the 19th century, women who encroached on the traditionally masculine concert hall, or here the even more decidedly masculine bandstand, were often met with open hostility. Despite a growing trend in forming dedicated women's orchestras and bands towards the turn of the century, and there actually were quite a lot of those, they still encountered a lot of resistance, and women continued to be routinely and overwhelmingly excluded from professional orchestras. Ladies' orchestras, both professional and amateur, playing in theatres, in tea shops, in exhibitions, in these kinds of spaces, they were really important institutions that offered training and employment to lots of women, and I don't want to underemphasise that because I think we do a bit of a disservice to women's history by pretending that there was no opportunities. It was still difficult though. but their existence further fueled ongoing debates about the status of professional versus amateur music making, which was really heightened here by the comparison implicit in the lucrative employment of a band, both foreign and female, in contrast to other local, and it might be assumed, male bands. So throughout the reception of the Viennese Ladies Orchestra, critics often focus their attention on the performers' bodies and their appearance, and particularly on details of their clothing. This was common to the reception of women musicians kind of more generally at the time, who were often regarded as women first and artists second, to quote Elizabeth Cortez, and where even the most highly successful performers remained caught in a web of conflicting ideas about the relative value of the works they performed, and problematic notions of the use of the body, to quote Catherine Ellis. So, for example, the Liverpool Courier only commented on the orchestra's first performance to say that they were attired in blue and white. These fair musicians looked charming. So the Liverpool Review too gave no details of the music, only describing the striking effect of their white dresses and tree fur sashes. The Liverpool Mercury gave a lengthy description of the women's appearance, sexualising the performers as nymphs. It described them as a well-figured body of ladies that looked like the prospective mothers of a military nation. There is something martial in their costumes of ruby satin bodices slashed across the breast after military fashion with silver braid, to which are subjoined their handsomely made short white muslin skirts. They soon settled down in the orchestra, and after a few premonitory twangs from recalcitrant violins, the Fräulein who leads the band stepped forward, and with earnestness in her face and energy in her arms, waved on her attendant nymphs. The music proceeded with occasional interludes of rest for a couple of hours, until indeed one began to wonder how these blonde musicians, hatless and in thin attire, could endure the chill night air. This same review extended its discussion of the appearances of women in the band to women in the audience, contrasting the orchestra's nymphs with the Lancashire witches settled down recumbently to listen while engaged in the hopelessly impossible task of inducing the abbreviated skirts of fashion to hide the persistently obtrusive and disobedient ankles of nature. Possibly a reference to the Pendle witches, but I don't really know. So when they actually addressed the music itself in the reception of this band, it was rarely reviewed positively. Despite the press's own reports of large, engaged audiences who were charmed by the strains of delightful music, reviewers instead really emphasised perceptions of the kind of physical strength or weakness, which were concepts often raised in 19th century criticism of women's musical abilities. So it's not unusual to see women criticised for a perceived lack of strength or power. As the Porcupine magazine described the orchestra, they produced a musical effect that would be reckoned weak even for a second-rate spa band. Although the reviewer apparently enjoyed the charm of novelty in seeing a number of girls in pretty uniforms fiddling through a set of German waltzes. The Liverpool Review also described their tone as thin and scratchy, and not up to the standard that we have a right to expect, considering the excellent local material we have ready to be utilised. Letters to the editor also often discuss the orchestra in similar terms. One writer in the Liverpool Mercury, using the pseudonym Bagpipes, and describing himself as a Scotchman who delights in really good and powerful instrumental music, was disappointed by the apparent lack of power in the women's playing. Though he actually said he really liked the music, apparently, he thought for their own well-being, the women shouldn't be playing outdoors. And this letter ends by adding that a lady friend had drawn his attention to the women's lack of hats, and asked that the exhibition provide them with suitable covering for their heads during the cold nights, so very concerned. Other commentators made pointed mention of the need to strengthen the exhibition's musical program, basically by employing British military bands instead of these foreign women. According to a letter in the Liverpool Mercury, when you have a good article at home, it's better to employ it than travel farther afield on the plea that an imported article must be superior. So to kind of wrap up overall, the Strauss Orchestra in London in 1885, the Austrian Band in Melbourne in 1880, and the Viennese Ladies Orchestra in Liverpool in 1886 were all critiqued either by the musical press or by local musical communities in fairly nationalistic terms. And the critics argued that their place, and often their salaries, really should have been given instead to local British or Australian performers. But they weren't the only foreign performers who appeared at these exhibitions, like by any stretch. As I mentioned before, Dutch and Belgian early music ensembles appeared to really glowing receptions from the same critics at the same exhibitions. And much prestige was given to Australia by, say, like the Sydney exhibition appointing the Milanese conductor Paolo Ghiozza as its musical director. It appears that musical communities were willing to accept the expertise of outsiders performing high art or lending higher status to the event, essentially bringing with them a kind of embodied cultural capital. These musicians could apparently provide something previously unavailable to the local musical community and were widely accepted in the hope that they would maybe kind of transfer some of that capital to the community itself. This was not the case with music that was perceived to be of a lower status. For example, light orchestral or band music. This music was already perceived to be lesser in these contexts because of its commercial implications. Everyone knew that it was there to make people buy tickets, to draw a big crowd. And all the musicians were well paid for it. As Derek Scott argues, when Schumann writes of the gold rattling in Strauss Singer's pocket as he conducts, he's not making any comment about the quality of the music, he's indicating his disgust at the intermingling of music and commerce. So when this kind of music was also performed by outsiders, those invested in local music really felt that it was more degrading to their own capabilities, like it was an admission or a kind of capitulation that they might even require help in this lesser area. This is largely related to a kind of musical and cultural insecurity in both 19th century Britain and Australia. Throughout this period, Britain is considered to have had something of an identity crisis with regards to their kind of national music, which really culminated in the constant need to assert that they were not the land without music. And I feel like I should assert here that I don't think that they were, but that doesn't change that overall perception that still kind of persists to this day. Australia at the same time were almost desperate to assert themselves as equal to Europe in musical standards, in a climate particularly of assumptions of British cultural superiority compared to the kind of colonial culture. This Australian insecurity can be seen in the disproportionate response to the employment of a single foreign band at Melbourne in 1880. Throughout these exhibitions, in the context of that broader narrative of universalism that pervaded all of these events, the musical press were actually generally compelled to write pretty positively of high art music regardless of who was performing it, as they felt it was important to support music that could be seen as high status or educational or morally improving in some way. They were equally compelled to criticise music that did not conform to their rigid ideas of cultural status. So even the British and Australian bands playing popular music were generally negatively received. When any music other than high art was presented by foreign musicians, however, this criticism was really further compounded, and it brought out the insecurities that the critics held in their own national musical capabilities, resulting in a surprisingly defensive and nationalistic response. So I'm going to leave it there, but thank you for having me and thank you for listening, and I hope there's something in that.
That was so fascinating, Sarah. Thank you so much, and there's so many questions I could ask. But I wonder if I might open it out to the floor first of all, or maybe I should kickstart it with a question of my own. I'm just wondering if you perceive there was a moment in history where certainly you were talking about Brexit and this, various forms of nationalism are still, perhaps even being ramped up in the early 21st century. But in terms of the reception of musicians from elsewhere at some sort of international gathering like this, do you think there was a period of time where this kind of nationalistic response to imported musicians began to fade in places like Australia and England?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think probably after the First World War, there was a real kind of, I think people had seen where the kind of extremes of nationalism could lead and the kind of horror of that. And so you start to see things like after the League of Nations is formed, it becomes things like Musical League of Nations and the International Society for Contemporary Music and things like that that are, in at least the way they're described, they're meant to be universalist. They're meant to sort of break down the national divisions, or call it in direct response to the kind of outcome of the First World War. So I think that's probably, yeah, and that sort of starts to ramp up again into the second.
Yeah.
It didn't last long.
Yeah. And I guess equally, I mean, the other aspect of what you're talking about is that kind of that perception of a high-low, cultural divide, and the particular criticism of music's considered popular or not educated. People, the general masses who would have attended these events. My perception is that kind of othering of popular music by a cultural elite only really seemed to break down probably in the 1960s with the cultural assessments of the Beatles. So even through the first half of the 20th century, various forms of jazz, even those that were considered a sort of avant-garde by some, were still often, criticised in relationship to art music. I just wondered if you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, totally. I think you're totally right about the sort of 60s as this point where it starts to disintegrate, and it just makes me think of like the middlebrow movement in the kind of 1920s and 1930s, where there was a kind of attempt to popularise the high art, kind of, you get Reader's Digest type things, CDs with like the classical hits kind of thing, to try and make them more easily acceptable or kind of understood in this, and that is so wrapped up in that high-low divide to kind of even be describing it in terms of a middle ground, that you don't see that breaking down until definitely the middle of the century.
It's interesting that something like the Strauss Orchestra wouldn't have been thought of in those terms in the 1880s as a kind of bridge between.
Yeah, I sort of originally conceived of that Strauss thing as like a middlebrow thing, but I think it's like historically not the right term, because that as a concept wasn't really a thing yet, but it's like a proto-middlebrow almost. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if it was deliberately trying to introduce people to kind of classical music, but it was definitely using that sound world, but in a very kind of populist way.
Yeah. Anyone like to ask Sarah any questions about the presentation or the themes of the presentation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think those journals were really influential. I think obviously the audiences were still coming. I don't know whether the same people who were reading musical journals were the same people who were going to the concerts, but it's definitely, it sets up lots of prejudices for kind of future programming and things like that. So when people are reading these journals, they're the people who are making decisions about what gets, who gets employed and what gets funded. So it is influential in like that way, but I don't know how much of the public was necessarily caring what these critics thought. The critics definitely thought the public should care what they thought, but yeah.
Jack?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you're talking about the reception, the critical reception to the Strauss band, and it seems like there's lots of xenophobia embedded in that reception. Did that criticism or critique of their performance, did that follow through to the pieces themselves? Like, was there a sense that, Weber and Freischütz is all right, but Strauss waltzes aren't? Like, did they make distinctions in that high-low?
Yeah, not really. I think it's entirely about the performer, and if this, exactly the same program could be played by a different band and it would get a completely different reception.
Yeah.
The idea of music across different social classes kind of like started to disintegrate and blur a little bit like in the 19th century. So in terms of these exhibitions and who was allowed to attend and who was, I guess, allowed to perceive the music, was there mainly an audience of people of a higher status class, or were there critics and like mass audience members across different classes as well?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it was technically open to everybody. They had, because they were meant to be educational, kind of edifying things, and this was in a period of very Victorian kind of, rational recreation and wanting to kind of improve the masses. They had all sorts of initiatives like particular days where the tickets were reduced prices, so people on lower incomes could come in, or they had excursions from poor schools and orphanages and things like that to kind of open it up to everybody. They were open on the weekend or on Sunday when not necessarily everybody was working. It's actually really interesting. Some of the critics talk about how on the days when it's full price and you have lots of the kind of upper middle class people coming in with more disposable income, they pay less attention to the music. They're kind of just there to be seen, whereas the kind of lower middle class audiences and working class audiences are actually engaging with things in a more profound way. But again, that's just a critic's view of it. But yeah, good question.
Joe, did you have a thought?
Yeah. Thank you first of all for a really detailed and rich and fascinating presentation. I was interested in the phrase that you sort of used at the beginning and the end. Does land on a music, or in English, the land without music? And I was intrigued by this because even though it's a phrase which, being understood and thrown around in German, initially sort of came from the outside, in the context of educational reforms around music and promoting musical nationalism, it's something that you hear spread about by British musicians, maybe more than anyone else. I wondered, in the context of these outcries in the press about foreign musicians doing jobs that the English could do just as well for themselves, and to add insult to injury, foreign women, no less. How important is it for nationalism, whether music or otherwise, to be sort of to be feeling fragile, and is that a kind of a concept with a gendered element?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. That this response was so embedded in that kind of insecurity that phrase kind of conjures up. I think it's funny that they kind of react so strongly to this, but at the same time there are no concerts of Purcell or anything like that. The point where I think Britain can kind of say, yes, we do have a composer who did some stuff. And not really any attempts to push a kind of new art music or anything like that. It's just, I think, I'm not sure about the gendered element in terms of what did you mean by that?
I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I wondered, if the idea of being a land without music is sort of being used as a pretext for asserting the need for, a national idiom.
So it's sort of emasculating or something like that.
And presumably, I'm thinking of other sources as well, where the a bit later on, John Alexander Fuller Maitland is writing the history of the last couple of centuries and complaining that music's been relegated to being a pastime for women, and that the men need to be proud of making music, and sort of wondering if the sort of push is for great composers internationally who are presumably male. I'm not sure what I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and it's, you know, maybe part of the reason that they didn't try and push a kind of British music and composers was because there were sort of more masculine things like manufacturing that they could push, and so it was just like a, you know, no need to bother with that because we've got these other things that we can assert. But yeah, Fuller Maitland, apparently that exhibition with Strauss, that was when he discovered early music, that he went to those early music concerts, so yeah.
I just wondered, Sarah, I mean, there's so many things to unpack from the presentation, but I wondered if the idea of mass events intended to educate the public has disappeared, and if, I mean, I know we still have these things called expos,
Yeah.
but it seems like that the sort of experience that you're talking about in the late 19th century isn't really around. And do you think that that sort of event has disappeared?
Yeah, it's funny, they still do have World's Fairs. I think there's one in Dubai at the moment, but they are on the far more commercial end than they've ever been, I think now. It's about sort of showing off new technologies and things like that. And yeah, I can't think of an equivalent today, particularly from the kind of cultural side. I mean, you get large-scale festivals, I suppose, things like, I don't know, in Melbourne we have a festival. Yeah, the Melbourne Festival is a big thing that has sort of events and exhibitions associated with it, but there's nothing in a kind of specific location that you could go to for that sort of thing.
Yeah, or something like the Adelaide Festival,
Yeah,
where
exactly.
there are amazing exclusive events, but it's really if you can afford to go and see them.
Yeah, so there's the kind of cost of it as well as the fact that it's not centralised. It's sort of various theatres and various galleries and things that kind of feed into the festival. So yeah, so it's sort of related to festival culture, but it's not quite the same thing.
Look, another thought I had just before I see if there are any last questions from the floor is it seems to me that there's a special kind of malice by a certain type of critic reserved for that idea of popularising culture, maybe particularly music that's supposed to be highbrow. And I'm just thinking about, as I referenced before, I teach a first year unit called Popular Music Histories, and it's a survey unit, and I, spend way too much time choosing 80 musical examples to try and represent some history of popular music. And it just occurred to me that it would never occur to me to consider Andre Rieu or, the Three Tenors. They're these incredibly popular performers, but they just don't enter my field of vision. And it seems to me there's still a kind of real arm's length place at that kind of musician.
Andre Rieu is a really good, I think, comparison to this kind of stuff because he's enormously popular. He fills stadiums and things like that, and it's, you just wouldn't think of it when you're sort of going popular music. But yeah, I think that's probably the inheritor of this tradition. That's probably also where some of the kind of venom in the criticism comes from, because I know every musician that I know makes vomiting noises when you mention Andre Rieu.
It's funny because I've got lots of records, and I've got a record of CPE Bach music that I picked up at an op shop a long time ago for 50 cents, but I really like the music. I can't remember what the works are, but one day I was looking at it, and it's Andre Rieu in his pre-fame career.
Wow.
So,
Is he playing an instrument?
what's that?
Is he actually playing an instrument?
I can't remember. I think
Or is
he's
he
just conducting. Yeah. Jade.
You were talking about sort of the condescending and pretty vicious reception of the women's band, and I was wondering if you see any links with, you were talking about sort of the way that light music was similarly dismissed. I was wondering if there was any sort of connection there with sort of light music maybe being gendered as effeminate, because you also talked about some of the accounts of women fans of the light orchestras, and the tradition of sort of music that attracts the predominantly female audience tends to be dismissed and criticised.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think probably relates to what Joe was saying as well. Yeah, that there's this idea of light music is not, you know, it's not serious music, it's not masculine, it's not, you know, for the men in the concert hall. Yeah, but then at the same time, the kind of band music, even now, is still this very like blokey kind of space, right? So it's, yeah, I wonder how much of it's also related to like the specific instrumental makeup of them as well. You know, so the Viennese Ladies Orchestra, they weren't all playing the trombone. You know, there was a string orchestra component as well that makes it kind of a bit more feminized, even if they're playing the same works as, you know, a factory band full of men playing with the tuba. So yeah, it's a good point.
And it almost maps onto that pop rock
Yeah.
divide,
Yeah.
which I've also talked to the students about, of course, and that idea of rockism, of valorising rock, usually coded male, as
Yeah.
opposed to pop, often coded female.
Yeah.
But it seems that, I mean, I think that over the last 20, 30 years, that's really broken down. And in the 2000s, there was this talk of a thing called poptimism, where pop artists that in the 20th century, late 20th century, would have been relegated to, you know, being dismissed, began to be celebrated. I think that's a really positive thing. But I do think that things like amateur orchestras and brass bands are still, haven't been repatriated at all. It's the last frontier of
Yeah.
pop.
I think there's also a kind of national aspect of this as well, because there are things like in these exhibitions, even in the early music things, that Dutch early music, people like, what's his name? So Dutch organ music is seen as very kind of masculine compared to, say, Palestrina, who, because he's Italian, is very kind of effeminate, and so there's these kind of, like national stereotypes that have a kind of gendered association as well that come out through this. It's interesting that all of these bands are Austrian, and they all had the same criticism, so I wondered if that was similar.
Yeah, fascinating.
Just a quick question. Sorry, I'll be quick. Just a quick one. You mentioned the Paris exposition, and you know, and the gamelan. There seemed to be a lot of exoticism going on at that exposition. The British and Australian ones, is that similar, or did that sort of xenophobia come in?
Yeah, there much less in sort of opportunities to hear non-Western musics at these events. There's a couple at the same exhibition as Strauss. There was a Thai sort of gamelan type band, but was the King of Siam's court band. And the year earlier there'd been a Chinese orchestra there that also had a completely distinct reception that's also incredibly racist and things. Really, I think interesting with the Australian exhibitions is there's absolutely no engagement with First Nations music at all, or even sort of First Nations culture, except for in these kind of historic exhibitions of aspects that are meant to be kind of like looking back at the ancient history. There's a real kind of temporal, that they don't really sort of think of First Nations music as existing in the now, almost. So I think there's an exhibition in Adelaide about the same time, and that's the only one that I can find any Aboriginal music at all. And
From
that's
the late 19th century.
Yeah. Every other one just seems to completely ignore that. So at Melbourne and at Sydney, there just wasn't any like non-Western music at all.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, thank you so much. So much. We can keep discussing. Sorry?
Question?
Oh, Claire.
Just a small question. Do you think that it seemed that the people who felt nationalistic, particularly regarding these groups, were more of the intelligentsia and sort of people who'd be writing reviews, whereas you mentioned Brexit, and do you think there's been a bit of a change that the sort of the people, not thinking specifically of music, but the sort of nationalistic feeling is not so much, it's changed to a more populist thing perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been kind of mobilised as a popular kind of thing that, to kind of, as a kind of mass movement with things like Brexit and then all the kind of consequences of that, and seeing the same thing here and in the US, things like that. But yeah, I think it's really hard to say because we don't have sources from the 19th century so much of what the kind of non-intelligentsia class thought, because things didn't get written down or preserved in the same way, so it's really hard to say, but it's a good question.
Right, yeah.
But it's also, I heard an interesting interview with an author called, I think her name is Barbara Kingslove. She wrote a book called The Poisonwood Bible, and she's from Appalachia, as she pronounces it. I always thought it was Appalachia. And she was talking about how people in her part of the world are typecast as being, you know, hillbillies, hicks, uneducated, Trump supporters. And you know, she was talking about how she felt that kind of discrimination as someone at university when she moved out of her area, and that's why people have turned towards Trump, is because there's an educated elite who it doesn't even occur to them not to look down on that underclass, you know, and Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables and all that stuff. And so that idea of Brexit and whether it's moved to the lower classes, I wonder if it's this sort of bifurcation, which again is kind of artificial.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, thinking about at least the bands, like a lot of the performers in the bands that were, you know, not being asked to play because of these foreign bands, but there would have been working class. So being able to sort of say what their opinion would have been would be really helpful here. But
as always, we see this kind of intersectional matrix of class and gender and ethnicity.
Yeah, completely.
Joe, you seem to be...
Is it all right to... Sorry. I just wondered if it's okay, since how we've got people who are, you know, at various stages of learning about research and musicology, and you had such a wonderful collection of source materials there to really sort of bring these ideas and you know, in a way, the period that you're talking about to life for us. Would it be all right to talk a little bit about the methodology? Like how do you find and gather all these things together, and then how do you put them into some sort of framework?
Yeah, it's a good point. It took a long time. So this was a PhD thesis that is a chapter of a PhD thesis, I think, which possibly gives you an indication of the scope of the sources I was working with. It was a lot of stuff. I was incredibly fortunate to have funding to be able to just spend months in archives going through boxes, finding letters and programs and images, and particularly because this sort of Victorian period is when we really start getting mass publications. There's just an enormous amount of material, and also an enormous amount that's been preserved, because it was also a period where people thought collecting stuff, the exhibitions are like a manifestation of that, but everybody was collecting stuff and ordering it and putting it in, you know, for safekeeping. So really fortunate in terms of the amount of material, but it was, you know, at times quite overwhelming. But I think the way I approached it, mainly because these events were so big and there are so many facets, was letting the material kind of guide the direction of the project. So I actually started off thinking that the entire thesis was going to be about nation and nationalism and internationalism. But this was all I found. Like, this was the only aspect where there was any kind of, within music, national agenda. So it just ended up being one chapter, and there ended up actually being heaps more material about non-Western musics, the kind of idea of objects as representative, you know, musical instruments as representing entire cultures or entire musical traditions, you know, kind of Marxist analysis of commodity culture that goes into that as well. And so absolutely wasn't the plan when I started, but having so much material and letting those things kind of guide it, I think, is how I ended up with the overall structure that I had. And at the same time, it's also limited by, again, what survives. So the Liverpool exhibition, I have these conversations about women there because so much of that came up in the press, but there actually isn't an archive of the Liverpool exhibition's kind of organisation because it was bombed in the Second World War and everything burnt. So similarly, the Sydney exhibition, the Garden Palace, which is in the gardens next to the Con and the Opera House down there, that burnt down about 2 years after it opened, so all of their records are gone. So my focus was basically based on what came out of the archives and what had survived. So there's definitely huge holes in it. I don't pretend that they aren't there, but you just couldn't possibly do a project that big with everything being cohesive and Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I'm just thinking, from the point of view of if I'm interested as, say, like an undergrad,
Yeah.
if I'm interested in, working with archive stuff and finding it, do I have to have like a special doing a PhD pass to go and find this stuff at the State Library?
No, really. Particularly with the State Library, anyone can go in. You just need to get a library card, and they're free, and you can request material, and usually librarians are really happy to help you if you've got a project in mind, or you use the catalogue and you can see that there might be something in there. Not everything is catalogued to a kind of great level of detail, but I know working at the Granger Museum, I mean, part of my job is as a research fellow doing research, but the other part of it is facilitating research requests. So if somebody emails me and says, do you have anything on this topic, I can go and look for that and get back to them, and we can kind of talk about how to access that. And it doesn't matter whether it's an undergrad doing an essay, or a PhD student, or someone who finished years and years ago and is just interested. So I think archivists want to talk to you. we like requests. The only thing with undergraduate requests I find with the Granger is we have a really slow process, so it can take like 2 or 3 weeks to get material from storage to the reading room for people to be able to see. So if you've got an essay due in a week, it can't help. But yeah, in terms of larger projects, definitely.
It's just a reminder of the incredible resources these archives are. And, I'd be preaching to the converted, because I think the people in this room are the sorts of people who, undergraduate people in the room, would be the sort of people who would use those resources, but it is very hard to get students off their screens to think there might be anything beyond the internet to find.
Yeah. So I think, the last 2 years have been horrible, but one of the sort of silver linings of that is a lot of these collections have started putting more of their resources towards digitising things and making things more accessible that way. So I think we're probably, at a point where I still think you should go to the archives, but there is definitely more available online than there ever has been.
Yeah. Let's give Sarah a round of applause. That was fantastic. Now I'm aware that we're running